When SpaceChem was released back at the start of 2011, I had never heard of it, and in fact I wouldn't hear about it for a long time after that. Eventually, sometime near the end of the year, it managed to catch my eye and I bought it, not really knowing what to expect and not anticipating much as a result. What I got was one of the best puzzle games ever made. The game has been labelled a design-based puzzle game, which is really a fancy way of saying that it's more open-ended than other games. I'm going to spend a lot of time in this video explaining how the game works, so please be aware if you've already played SpaceChem, there might not be much here of interest to you. It's a difficult premise to sum up, but at its core it's about building machines which process chemicals from one form to another. In SpaceChem, the player has to take inputs from the input zone on the left side of the screen, process them in some way, and drop them in the output zone on the right side of the screen. They accomplish this using two things called Waldos, which follow the player's instructions. Instructions are placed on the playing grid, and when the Waldo comes in contact with the instruction, it executes it. Since the playing grid is limited, the amount of instructions is limited as well. Here's the simplest example. On the left, the player is given a hydrogen atom. On the right, they're asked to output a hydrogen atom as well. In other words, the input and output are the same. All the Waldo has to do is take this atom from one side of the grid to the other. Here it is in action. First, the Waldo hits the input instruction, which triggers the atom to enter the grid on the left-hand side. Next, the Waldo follows the arrows and arrives at the grab instruction. This means it grabs the atom and takes it with it. It keeps going along the way, following the arrows I've laid down for it, until it hits the drop instruction, leaving the atom in the output zone. Finally, it hits the output instruction, which removes the atom from the grid. With that complete, all the Waldo needs to do is continue running in a loop until it outputs 10 atoms. Of course, this is just the simplest example to demonstrate the principles. In reality, the input and the output are never the same. The goal is for the player to take an input of a certain type and turn it into something else before outputting it. One of the ways this is done early on is by bonding two atoms together. For example, the player might be given two hydrogen atoms and asked to output a hydrogen molecule. This involves bringing both atoms over the bonder pads and linking them together. Now you've got a molecule, you can output it. The game quickly builds on these basics by giving the player new instructions and more challenging molecules. After a little while, it then introduces the impressive production levels. Rather than taking place in a single reactor like the previous levels, this one tasks players with linking several reactors together. The output of one reactor can become the input in another, allowing the player to do far more complicated things than they could previously, and introducing some new challenges as well. One of the biggest strengths of the main campaign is the pace at which it introduces new concepts. After the production levels, sensors are introduced. After sensors, fission. And after that, flip-flop switches. It's constantly building, and it's especially noteworthy how perfectly smooth the difficulty curve is, despite how open-ended the puzzles are. Even though there's many different ways any given level can be tackled, the next one always feels just a little bit harder. This continues for the vast majority of the game. The levels which introduce new concepts are particularly well balanced in this regard. On some level they feel like a tutorial, guiding you to an understanding of the new mechanic, but they're also often more difficult than the preceding levels. I get the feeling this is due to the order they're introduced. Flip-flop switches, for example, are introduced near the end, and on the surface they seem like a relatively simple instruction, but in reality they allow the Waldos to perform much more complicated tasks. This holds true for the other instructions as well. They each bump up the complexity by the right amount. The way these all eventually combine allows the machines to do amazing things. The limitations on each reactor feel perfect as well. There's just the right amount of space inside to give the player some breathing room, but not so much they can exploit it for an easy victory. The paths on the Waldos feel like a very natural limitation too, and even the simple arrow instructions can eventually play crucial parts in whether or not a certain reactor design is going to work out. If you've never played SpaceChem, then all that might sound intimidating, but there's a few tutorial levels in place which really ease you in, and the concepts are introduced at a very even and deliberate pace. Eventually though, the game had turned into one of the most difficult ones I had ever played, and I really appreciated that it wasn't treating me like an idiot. Since the game becomes brutally difficult by the end, statistics show that only a very small percentage of players complete it. I still have a few levels to go myself, but the main campaign has already kept me busy for around 50 hours, so there's a good chance even if you never finish the game, you're going to get your money's worth out of it. It's best to approach the game with an open mind and realise as long as you enjoy the first few worlds, you'll get plenty of value from the experience. There's also a heap of extra assignments released since the game has come out, and some of those are on the easier end of the spectrum as well. The post-release dedication is pretty impressive. new assignments are still occasionally being released, and a level editor was added so players can create and share new challenges with each other. I'd say SpaceChem has become a game you can play endlessly, but it always was. Even the main campaign begs to be played over and over again. Since the puzzles have no set solution that you need to follow, this means some solutions will be better than others. There's a couple of categories you can compete in, but the best one as far as I'm concerned is speed. The game measures the number of cycles the Waldos take before they manage to complete the level, meaning you're encouraged to make them run as efficiently as possible. To go back to my earlier example, here's that Waldo dropping off hydrogen atoms again. But if you look at the route it takes, it's longer than it needs to be. We can shorten the route like so, and now the Waldo is running a little more efficiently. There's all sorts of little tricks you can use to make the reactors run just a little bit more efficiently, and as you complete new levels you might learn new techniques which can be used to improve your previous solutions. The game reinforces this drive for perfection by comparing your stats to all the other players, placing you on a graph to let you know if you are better or worse than average. One of the few things I dislike about the game is the way each reactor is automatically saved as you tinker about with it. When you go back to mess with previous reactors, it can be easy to screw them up, so it would be nice to be able to keep a save of it while it's in working order. Not having this option discourages players from messing around in some of the more complicated levels. Once I got a level working, I really didn't want to break it. An overall save file for the whole game can be backed up, but it's tucked away in a remote folder, and ideally this would have been built into the game itself. Another disappointing element for me personally were the defense missions, which see the player trying to stop the destruction of some key structure by firing off a laser or blowing up silos at a certain time. These always felt like a chore to me, as though they weren't true SpaceChem levels in a way, although at least I can say they're unique and they're probably the highlights of the game for some people. Both of those issues are quite small, and in the grand scheme of things they're vastly overshadowed by the positive sides to SpaceChem. I'm not exaggerating when I say some of the missions in SpaceChem left me with an immense amount of satisfaction. Often when I started a new level and saw what was being asked of me, I had absolutely no idea how I could manage to get it done. Some of them just seem impossibly hard when you look at them for the first time. Bit by bit though, it starts to come together if you just start working on it. You try one thing and it breaks, you try another thing and it breaks again, but slowly you start arriving at a solution. By the end, you've accomplished something you didn't think you were capable of just an hour ago, and the resulting machine is incredibly satisfying to watch. I found myself going back to previously completed levels sometimes just to watch my solutions play themselves out, and I highly doubt I'm the only one who did. So we come to the question of why I feel SpaceChem is underrated. Well, it eventually got a fair amount of attention from the gaming press, but as far as I'm concerned, the coverage of it was still quite lacking. I believe SpaceChem is a very special game, the kind of tightly structured but deep gameplay mechanics that don't come around often. I would have liked to see it get more exposure, but that's really besides the point. By far the biggest problem the game has is how intimidating it is. There's a reason I've spent a lot of this video explaining the game, because I'm hoping it will intrigue people and make it look a bit less off-putting. It really is a game worth playing, but Zachtronics have had a hard time communicating the concept to people, and even their introductory video does a poor job of explaining the basic concepts. The visuals don't help matters either. The truth is the game has very little to do with chemistry. It's certainly not scientifically rigorous or anything, it simply uses chemistry as a backdrop for some puzzle mechanics. You can adequately enjoy this game even if you've never so much as glanced at a periodic table in your entire life. A different theme may have really helped to capture the public's imagination, and would have assisted the press in giving the game more publicity. Looking at SpaceChem to begin with, it just looks like a baffling grid covered in lines. If the game was about, say, little robots moving around on a factory floor, it would have been a lot more understandable at a glance. I love the sort of mad science vibe I get from the game at the moment, and if that's what Zachtronics want to do with their game, that's fine by me, but I do think it turned many people away as well, which is a shame. As a small, independent title, SpaceChem is almost entirely reliant on word of mouth to earn its sales, and I think many people who have played the game have tried to spread the word about it to their friends. I don't know how successful the game has been financially, it seems to be doing alright, but alright isn't good enough for a game of this caliber. So allow me to do my part and try to spell out the appeal of this game as I see it. When you play most puzzle games, or play a puzzle embedded in a larger game, you're going to end up following a very strict path that a designer has laid out for you. Usually when a puzzle in a game perplexes me, I end up solving it by wondering what the designer wants me to do. In a sense, sometimes I'm not even solving a puzzle, I'm just following their train of thought to its conclusion. This is because puzzle designers are busy chasing after that eureka moment which is supposed to happen when everything finally clicks into place. SpaceChem treats players with more intelligence than that. It trusts you to work out genuine problems by yourself, and there's no path for you to follow to get there. Since they're a very gradual process, the game does sort of lack that eureka moment, but when it does slot all together, it feels far more rewarding than it would otherwise. You accomplish something yourself, and in the later levels there's a good chance you're the first player to complete that problem with that exact method. If you ask me, SpaceChem doesn't really deserve to be branded with the same title as those other games. Instead of calling it a puzzle game, it might be better described as a problem-solving game. For anyone tired of being asked to solve condescending puzzles, SpaceChem is the perfect way to challenge yourself and have a blast while doing it. It won't teach you much about chemistry, but it might just enhance your critical thinking along the way. At its best, solving a problem in SpaceChem left me with a sense of satisfaction I didn't think computer games could provide. So for anyone out there on the fence about this game, I highly encourage you to take the plunge. Its bark is a lot worse than its bite.